Chapter 10. The shepherds had made it back to the oasis by evening, and the tragedy of the sheep was already a distant memory by the next day. Langford had never experienced anything quite like the sudden loss of the flock during his 4 months with the justices. It was a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of the rugged terrain they called home. He couldn't help but recall August Justice's heartbreaking display of hopelessness, but now the man seemed to have moved on completely. He had a lot of work to do, and he tackled each task with unwavering determination. If Langford didn't know any better, he would have assumed August was indifferent to the loss of his sheep. But he knew better. This Mormon was a man of faith and compassion who accepted whatever fate threw his way. The tragedy of the sheep was just one more hardship in a life full of them, and Langford couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the man's resilience. Mescal and Wolf were understandably saddened by the loss of their livelihood, but they perked up when August announced his plan to venture across the river to the Navajo range to trade for a new flock. He wasted no time in getting ready for the trip. The snowmelt had long since subsided, and the water levels were low enough for him to safely cross with Billy. He hoped to bring the new sheep back before the summer rains hit. He also wanted to check up on his son Snap, who had been among the Navajos for longer than he anticipated. "I'll take Billy and go at once," he declared. "Dave, you're heading out to the Silver Cup Range with George and Zeke. Take Jack along with you and brand as many cattle as you can before the snow hits. Stay clear of Beale and Holderness's men. I won't tolerate any brawls. But keep your eyes peeled for their activities," instructed Langford. Langford was relieved that Snap Justice hadn't returned to the oasis yet. He felt a sense of liberation that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. He spent an entire summer day in the orchard and vineyard, which were in full fruit season. The grapes, plums, pears, and melons were ripe and delectable. The children were on vacation, and they were all over the trees like birds. The girls were picking grapes, and Mother Ruth enlisted Jack to help her with the pear trees. Mescal also joined in and caught the golden pears that Jack threw down. Wolf and Noddle were also there, and Black Topper nudged her black nose over the fence, whinnying for apples. The turkeys strutted around, the peafowls preened their beautiful feathers, and the guinea hens scurried like quail. If it weren't for the imposing red cliffs, Langford would have forgotten where he was. The warm sun, the yellow fruit, the cheerful screams of children, and the joyous laughter of girls brought back pleasant memories of autumn picnic days long gone. However, the sight of those dominating wind-scarred walls wouldn't let him forget. That night, Langford tried to see Mescal alone for a few minutes, to look at her once more with unguarded eyes, to whisper a few words, to bid her farewell. But it was impossible. The next day, Langford rode out of the Red Cliff Gate with Dave and the pack horses, his heart aching. In the midst of the crowd of cheering children and women who bid them goodbye, he caught sight of Mescal's wave and a look in her eyes that would stay with him forever. The thought of what could happen while he was away, if he ever came back, raced through Langford's mind as he rode on Silvermane's back. He could feel the anticipation of wild animals waiting for him out in the desert, under the glaring white sun and the slopes of Coconina. Despite the pang in his chest, he gritted his teeth and narrowed his eyes, eagerly facing the challenge ahead. That morning the wind blew fiercely off the Vermilion Cliffs towards the west, carrying no scent of river water. Langford couldn't help but think of the sheep drive's fatality as they rode on, knowing that the flock only met a moistened breeze on that narrow bench once a year. The bench and the treacherous strip of sand were soon left far behind, as were the maze of sculptured cliff under the blue star and the hummocky low ridges beyond with their dry white washes. Silvermane led the way, and Langford quickly learned that the gray would have no horse before him. His pace was swift, steady, and tireless. Dave, on his Navajo mount, had to hold his horse back with a firm rein. The pack train followed closely behind, with their white packs bouncing up and down like the humps of camels. As they approached the stony divide, Jack and Dave slowed their horses down. The ascent was miles long and so gradual that it didn't appear steep. The pack train caught up and followed closely behind the riders. From the broad, bare summit, Jack's eyes seemed to magnify the winding trail, the long red wall, the green slopes, and the dots of sage and cattle in the Silver Cup Valley range. He had learned to see over months of unobstructed vision, and his eyes had adjusted to distance and dimensions. Silver Cup Spring was nestled in a lush green oasis just below a rocky slope that eventually gave way to the thickly forested side of Coconina. The brothers' camp was perched on the slope, situated in a narrow crevice between two towering walls. The spot was well protected from the harsh winds blowing in from the north and west, offering a clear view of the valley and its trails. As Dave and Jack arrived, they were warmly greeted by Zeke and George, both of whom were awestruck by the sight of Silvermane. Zeke, who had seen the magnificent gray horse before, walked around him, admiring his powerful chest muscles and stroking his shimmering mane. "I can't believe my eyes," he marveled. "To see you saddled and bridled like this? You're even bigger than I remember. Langford, you've got yourself a horse that's one of a kind. If Beale ever lays eyes on him, he'll go crazy. That man knows a good horse when he sees one." After exchanging pleasantries, Dave inquired about the state of things. Zeke reported that they had been dealing with some trouble from old Whitefoot, who had been chasing their horses. The weather had been hot and dry, but there was still some decent grazing on the slopes. A group of steers had wandered up the mountain, while others had been spotted near the saddle or the canyon. Dave asked if they had been to Seeping Springs lately, and Zeke confirmed that they had. He reported that Holderness's cattle were still grazing in the upper valley, and that they had found tracks near the spring that suggested someone had been watching them and then fled when they arrived. George added that they would likely run into some of Holderness's men and Beale's crew when they set out on their next ride. Zeke mentioned that he had bumped into Two-Spot Cisco and Culver at the spring one day, which had taken them by surprise. As they chatted, they tried to remember which day it was. "Let me think. Today's Friday," George said. "On a recent Monday, a group of men rode through the area claiming to be tracking a horse that had broken free. However, something seemed off about their presence, and they quickly rode away. Upon further questioning, it was revealed that one of the men had ridden a horse with a missing shoe, which raised suspicions." Dave then shared a story about Cisco and Culver, who had caused trouble in the past by filling up a waterhole and causing the loss of thousands of sheep. The only survivor had been Mescal's belled lamb. Langford, who was new to the job of range rider, showed great enthusiasm and potential under Dave's guidance, despite his initially awkward riding style. As the conversation continued, Dave expressed his curiosity about who had hired Beale's men to plug the waterhole, as he believed that Beale himself wouldn't have done such a thing due to his love for horses. Zeke and George remained silent, and their expressions remained unchanged, but Langford noticed a certain intensity in their eyes. Overall, the group's interactions and discussions revealed a complex and intriguing world of ranching and range riding in the desert. As a newcomer on the ranges, Jack's vision became exceptionally sharp. With experience, he learned the landmarks, trails, distances, and the differences between smoke, dust, and haze. He could even distinguish between a band of mustangs and cattle, and range riders from outlaws or Indians. In short, he had learned to trust his judgment and acquired the basic features of a rider's training. However, Jack struggled with lassoing, which was another essential requirement of his new profession. Dave patiently remarked, "It's funny you can't get the hang of it. Maybe it's born in a fella. Now handling a gun seems to come naturally for some guys, and you're one of them. If only you could get the rope away as quickly as you can throw your gun." Despite his defeats and missed opportunities, Jack persisted and kept practicing. He might have failed altogether if he had been riding an ordinary horse or a fiery mustang. Fortunately, he rode Silvermane, an intelligent, beautiful, and fleet horse. Silvermane learned quickly and could make the agile turns and sudden stops necessary for roping. Moreover, he loved to run free, and his life had been spent watching everything on the range, including cattle, riders, mustangs, deer, and coyotes. Whenever Langford chased a cow, he only needed to start Silvermane and then focus on handling his rope. It took him 10 times longer to lasso the cow than it took Silvermane to head it. Dave laughed at some of Jack's exploits, encouraged him often, praised his intent if not his deed, and always nodded at Silvermane in mute admiration after a run. According to Dave, branding the cows, yearlings, and tame steers that watered at Silver Cup was just child's play. He insisted that the real work would come when they had to round up the wild steers up on the mountain and in the canyons. For him it was grueling work. By the end of each day he was so exhausted that he could barely drag himself to bed. His back felt like it had been broken, his legs were raw, and his bones ached. Some mornings he thought it would be impossible to get up, but he always managed to crawl out of bed and warm his sore and bruised muscles by the campfire. When Zeke and George rode in with the horses, the day's work began. Throughout the weeks of hardening up, as Dave called it, Langford endured a lot of pain, but he soldiered on and never missed a day. During the most trying times, when he had to be helped on and off Silvermane for a few days, the brothers made his work as light as possible. They gave him the branding outfit to carry, which consisted of a running iron, a pot of charcoal, and bellows. He followed the riders at a leisurely pace, some days branding up to 100 cattle. By October they had branded thousands of cows and steers with August Justice's crudely fashioned cross. Despite their efforts, the stock kept coming down from the mountain, driven to the valley by cold weather and snow-covered grass. It wasn't until well into November that the riders finished at Silver Cup. Then the question arose of whether to go to Seeping Springs or the canyons farther west along the slope of Coconina. George favored the former, but Dave overruled him, citing their father's orders. He wanted them to ride Seeping Springs last because he would be with them, along with Snap. "We're going to have some trouble over there," said George. "How's branding stock going to help?" he asked. "We Mormons never needed it." "Father says we all got to do it. Holderness has already branded his stock. He might have marked some of ours, too. If we brand our own, we'll know what's ours. If he drives our stock, we'll know it's stolen. If Beale steals, we'll have proof," replied the other. "What's the point? Do you think they'll care?" asked George. "No, but it'll be barefaced robbery. We know what's been happening, but we've never been able to prove it. We gotta stand by Father. I know your hand's itching for your gun, and so is mine. But we gotta obey orders," he said. The canyons and gullies on the slope of Coconina were filled with white sage, rich grass, and cold springs. The wild steers were as difficult to catch as wolves, hiding in thickets of juniper, manzanita, and weathered cliffs. The Mormons were relentless, however, and nothing stopped them. They climbed slopes that even deer couldn't stick to, fought through bayonet-guarded manzanita copses, and explored labyrinthine fastnesses. They even walked miles of sliding slopes and marble-bottomed stream beds, all to find the elusive wild steers. Langford was amazed by their tenacity and endurance. Climbing was tough, but the real challenge came when they had to corner a wild steer. Roping them on slopes made of weathered stone was no easy feat, and branding them on the edges of cliffs was downright dangerous. Days and weeks passed without anyone keeping track as the sun made its way lower in the sky and snow clouds crept down the slopes. Frost covered the ground in the morning and lingered in the shade throughout the day. Winter was fast approaching. Despite August Justice's warning, Langford persevered. He lost weight and suffered greatly, but he refused to give up. Eventually he became a tough-as-nails man, with muscles like wire and lungs like leather. He began his day at dawn, shedding the frost-coated tarp and immersing himself in the icy water. The cold air filled his lungs, and his step became like that of a deer hunter as he walked down the slope to his horse. He was no longer afraid that Silvermane would run away. The gray horse's bell could always be heard near camp, and when Langford whistled, Silvermane would answer with the sound of his hobbled feet. When Silvermane saw Langford coming through the cedars or across the grassy valley, he would neigh with joy. Langford had come to love Silvermane and often talked to him as if he were human. Each day the mustangs were brought into camp and the work began anew. It was the same work as yesterday, but with endless variety and ever-changing situations that demanded quick thinking, strong arms, brave hearts, and unwavering energy. As the sky darkened and the tips of the Vermilion Cliffs glowed in the setting sun, it was time to head back to camp. The group ate their meal voraciously and sat silently around the campfire, exhausted and ragged. Eventually they settled down for the night, their faces hidden in the shadows of the cedars. At the start of their arduous journey, Langford had made a conscious effort to forget about Mescal. For a time he had succeeded, consumed by the physical demands of the journey. However, thoughts of her soon crept back into his mind, and he found himself thinking of her constantly. The passing months, the changes in himself, the deepening bond between him and Dave, and even his love for Silvermane, all only served to make him think of her more fondly. Eventually, the snow forced the riders to retreat from their canyon camp and head towards Silver Cup, where they encountered August Justice and Snap, who had arrived the previous day. Dave surprised his father with the news that there were approximately 5,000 cattle in the canyons. August was skeptical, as they had not been back there in years, but Dave explained that the cattle had multiplied rapidly and were safe from the winter. They had a trail under the saddle, and they went down to the canyon to winter. Although they were wild, they were fatter than any other stock on the ranges and were unlikely to be discovered. August was elated by the news, calling it the best news he had heard in a long time. "All right, fellas, let's head up the mountain slope toward Seeping Springs. We'll drive the cattle down and finish up this branding," said August Justice. "Someone should go to White Sage and find out what's going on. What's Holderness up to? What's Beale doing? Is there any stock being driven to Lund?" "I'll go," offered Snap Justice. "I don't want you to," replied his father. "I guess we can wait until spring and all go together. I should have brought you boys some new clothes and boots. You all look pretty ragged, especially you, Jack. Have you been working as hard as you look?" "Father, he never missed a day," defended Dave. "And you know how tough it is to ride in these canyons." August chuckled and looked at Langford. "Wouldn't it be funny if Holderness tried to mess with you now? I always knew you'd do well, Jack. Now you're one of us, and you'll have a share with my sons in the cattle." But Langford couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort in Snap's presence. His sharp face and strange eyes made Langford feel hot inside. He had felt this way before, but never as strongly as now. Snap seemed different, though. He wasn't showing any signs of drunkenness like he usually does. He was good-natured, lively, and even cracking jokes. It was clear that Snap's evil side only came out when he was drunk. But Langford couldn't forgive or forget. He couldn't stop thinking about Mescal's beautiful eyes. She could be married to this man right now. Maybe that's why Snap was in such a good mood. The weight of uncertainty hung over him like a dark cloud, but he couldn't bring himself to ask August if the wedding had indeed taken place. He struggled for a day to accept the inevitability of the Mormon custom and forget about Mescal, but it was a losing battle. This surrender marked a crucial turning point in his life, though he couldn't quite grasp its significance. It was the end of his youthful innocence, the final step into forced manhood. The desert had transformed him not just physically but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually as well. He felt an ever-present, fiercely subtle force calling to him from beyond. He no longer tried to push Mescal out of his mind, acknowledging that the passing weeks and months had only deepened his love for her. Though it was a bittersweet realization, it brought him some measure of relief to speak the truth to himself. He no longer deluded himself into thinking he could have generous feelings towards Snap Justice, recognizing the jealousy within him for what it was. He knew it would eventually turn into hatred. On the third morning after leaving Silver Cup, the riders were making their way slowly along the slope of Coconina. Langford had driven down a bunch of cattle and found himself near the temporary camp on an open ridge. When he looked up the valley, he saw what looked like smoke hanging over Seeping Springs. "That can't be dust," he muttered to himself. "Looks blue to me." He studied the hazy bluish cloud for some time, but it was so far away that he couldn't be certain whether it was smoke or not. He decided to ride over and check it out, knowing that none of the justices were in camp and there was no telling when they would return. He set off alone, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Langford had planned to return before nightfall, but he wasn't too concerned since he had his blanket and provisions for himself and his horse, Silvermane. As they made their way across the range, Langford noticed a curious cloud in the distance. It turned out to be smoke, and he assumed it was coming from the range riders' campsite near Seeping Springs. Langford decided to investigate and rode his horse at a brisk pace for 3 hours until he reached a low knoll that concealed the springs. He remembered that the cattle pool was located in a grove of cedars below the red wall, but as he drew closer, he saw that something was amiss. Smoke was rising above the cedars, and he could hear the cattle bellowing in the distance. As he followed the trail through the cedars, he discovered that the pool had dried up, and the cattle were gathered around a new, larger pool that had been constructed nearby. A high corral surrounded the pool, and Langford could see that the flume that fed water to the pool was entirely fenced off. He scanned the area for signs of the range riders, but saw no one. As he rode down the ridge, Langford noticed fresh boot and horse tracks around a recently lit fire. Piles of logs were stacked nearby, indicating someone's intention to build a cabin. Enraged, Langford dismounted from his horse. It took only a few moments for him to push some of the fire under the fence and the rest of it against the pile of logs. The pitch pines exploded like rockets, driving the thirsty cattle back. "I'm going to follow those horse tracks," Langford said. He pulled down a part of the fence enclosing the flume, allowed Silvermane to drink, then started him on a fast trot on the white trail. The tracks he had decided to pursue were sharply defined. A few inches of snow had fallen in the valley and melted, softening the hard ground. Silvermane maintained his pace with the stamina of a desert horse. August Justice had once claimed that the stallion would find 50 miles a day to be child's play. Langford watched the trail speed towards him all afternoon until the end of Coconina rose above him. Long before sunset he had reached the slope of the mountain and had begun to climb. At the midpoint he came across the snow and counted the tracks of 3 horses. At twilight he rode into the glade where August Justice had waited for his Navajo friends. There, in a sheltered nook among the rocks, he unsaddled Silvermane, covered and fed him, built a fire, ate his meat and bread sparingly, and rolled up in his blanket, soon falling asleep. He was up and off before sunrise, and he emerged on the western slope of Coconina just as the shadowy valley awakened from its misty slumber into daylight. Soon the pink cliffs leaned out, shimmering and immense, changing from gloomy gray to a rosy glow, then brightening and reddening in the morning sun. The snow thinned and disappeared, but the iron-cut horse tracks were still visible on the trail. At the base of the mountain, the tracks left the White Sage Trail and turned north towards the cliffs. Langford scanned the red sage-spotted wasteland for Holderness's ranch. He found it, a dark blot on the rising edge of the valley beneath the towering pink cliffs, and directed Silvermane straight towards it. As the sun emerged from behind Coconina, its warmth fell on his back. From the ridge-tops he could see the black patch grow into cabins and corrals. As he drew nearer, he entered rolling pasture land where the bleached grass shone white and the cattle grazed in the thousands. This range had once belonged to Jacob Severino, and Langford thought of the bitter Mormon as he observed the snug cabins for the riders, the sprawling, picturesque ranch house, the large corrals, and the long flume that ran down from the cliff. There was a corral full of shaggy horses and another full of steers and 2 lines of cattle, one going into a pond corral and one coming out. The air was thick with dust. A bunch of yearlings were licking at huge lumps of brown rock salt. A wagon full of cowhides stood before the ranch house. Langford pulled up at the door and called out. A red-faced ranger with sandy hair and twinkling eyes appeared. "Howdy, stranger, come on in," he said. "Is Holderness around?" asked Langford. "Nope. He's taken a bunch of steers to Lund. I reckon he's in White Sage by now. I'm Snood, the foreman. Are you looking for a job as a rider?" "No," replied Langford. "Say, that horse!" exclaimed Snood. His gaze of friendly curiosity had shifted from Langford to Silvermane. "You can lock me up if that ain't the severe range stallion." "Yes," said Langford. Snood's shout drew 3 riders to the door, and when he pointed to the horse, they stepped out with good-natured grins and admiring eyes. "I've only seen him once," said one. "Good Lord, what a horse!" Snood walked around Silvermane. "If I owned this ranch, I'd trade it for that stallion. I know Silvermane. He and I had some chases over in Nevada." "Who are you, stranger?" asked Snood suspiciously. "I'm one of August Justice's riders," replied Langford. "Beale's spy," exclaimed Snood, eyeing Langford with interest but no ill will. "I've heard of you. What does one of Justice's riders want with Holderness?" "I rode into Seeping Springs yesterday," explained Langford, studying Snood carefully. "There was a new fenced-in pond, and our cattle couldn't drink. There were also a lot of trimmed logs and fresh tracks. I burned the corrals and logs and followed the tracks to this ranch." "The hell you did!" shouted Snood, his face turning red with anger. "You're the second man to accuse my riders of dirty tricks. That's enough for me. I quit. I steal no man's water. Is that good with you?" Langford extended his hand in agreement. "Your word goes. Dave Justice said you might be Holderness's foreman, but you weren't a liar or a thief. I'd believe it even if Dave hadn't told me. The men you tracked rode in here yesterday and are now gone. I never hired them," added Snood. "Good to hear," replied Langford, ready to leave. "I'm in a hurry. Good day, Snood." Once clear of the corrals, Langford saw White Sage was closer than he expected. He rode Silvermane most of the way and arrived at the bishop's barnyard, where he put up his horse. Then he headed to the house, following August Justice's path. As he approached the bishop's family, he realized they did not recognize him, despite their previous friendship. The old bishop prayed for him and reminded him of the laying on of hands. The women kindly served him food, while the young men provided him with new boots and garments to replace his tattered ones. They eagerly asked him about the justices, whom they had not seen in nearly a year. They were overjoyed at his restored health and welcomed him with open arms. Later, Langford sought a private conversation with the bishop's sons. He informed them of the sheep loss, the burning of the new corrals, and the tracks leading to Holderness's ranch. In turn, they warned him of the danger he was in and provided August Justice with desired information. Holderness had slowly but surely tightened his grip on the outlying ranges and water rights. Every month he acquired new territory and drove cattle regularly to Lund. It was no secret that much of the stock he drove came from the eastern slope of Coconina. However, he could not find enough riders to do his work. A suspicion that he was a rustler and not a cattleman had slowly gained ground. Although not spoken aloud, many believed it. Holderness's friendship with Beale had become offensive to the Mormons, who had once been on good terms with him. Beale's killing of Jacob Severino was believed to have been at Holderness's instigation. Severino had threatened Holderness, and after his death, Beale's band grew. No one knew how many men he had or who they were. Cisco and Culver were openly his lieutenants, and whenever they entered the village there was shooting. Disturbing rumors circulated regarding their treatment of Mormon women. The wives and daughters of once peaceful White Sage no longer dared to venture outdoors after nightfall. The village was overflowing with money and whiskey like never before. Lund and the few villages to the north were just as terrified as White Sage. It was a bitter tale. The bishop and his sons attempted to convince Langford the next morning to leave the village without meeting with Holderness, insisting that it would be a useless endeavor. "I will see him," Langford declared. He spent the morning at the cottage, and when it was time to depart, he smiled at the anxious faces. If I wasn't able to take care of myself, August Justice would never have said so. If Langford had asked himself what he intended to do when he faced Holderness, he couldn't have answered. His emotions were repressed, bound, but there was something festering inside of him. His mind was steeped in an atmosphere of still thunder. He vividly remembered the quaint wide street and the gray church. As he rode, many people stopped to stare at Silvermane. He turned the corner onto the main thoroughfare. A new building had been added to the several stores. Mustangs stood, bridles down, before the doors, and men lounged along the railings. As he dismounted, he heard the loungers speak about his horse, and he saw their laid-back manner become alert. He entered the store to meet more men, including August Justice's friend Abe. Langford could have been a stranger in White Sage for all the recognition he received, but he aroused something more intense than curiosity. He asked for spurs, a clasp knife, and some other necessities, and when momentarily out of sight behind a stack of boxes, he whispered his identity to Abe. The Mormon was dumbfounded. When he emerged from his stupor, he showed his joy and silently pointed toward the saloon. Langford faced the open door. The room had been expanded, now on the same level as the store floor. The air was thick with smoke, reeking of rum, and filled with the raucous voices of rough, tough men. One man was dancing a jig in the center of the room when he suddenly stopped and straightened up upon seeing Langford. The room fell silent, perhaps due to the sudden cessation of the dance or the sharp glint in Langford's eyes. He had sworn to never forget the scarred face of the outlaw Cisco, and seeing it now was like a meteor crashing into his mind. A sudden fury coursed through his veins, and he took a long stride toward Cisco. The outlaw hesitated, unsure if this was a friend or foe. His eyes darted around, trying to read Langford's intentions from his face. Someone in the crowd whispered hoarsely, "Look how he packs his gun." Another replied, "Not 6 men in Utah pack a gun like that." Cisco heard them, and his face turned pale. Langford demanded, "Do you know me?" Cisco's response was to jerk his hand towards his hip, but Langford was faster, knocking the gun out of his hand. "Too slow," he said before flinging Cisco backwards and pummeling him against the log wall. Cisco crumpled to the ground as Langford kicked his gun out of the way and turned to face the crowd. Holderness, the tallest man in the room, stood at the forefront, his piercing eyes glinting like ice. Langford asked him curtly, "Do you know me?" Holderness was seething with anger when Langford entered the saloon. "I certainly don't," Holderness replied when Langford asked if he had any objections to his presence. "You slapped my face once." Langford leaned in close to the rancher. "Slap it now, you rustler," he challenged. The room fell silent as Langford and Holderness locked eyes. Suddenly, Holderness accused Langford of being Beale's spy. Langford responded by slapping Holderness in the face. He then backed away with his right arm held high, ready for a gunfight. "Don't try to draw, Holderness. That's August Justice's trick with a gun," whispered a man in the room. Langford revealed that he had burned the new corrals that Holderness's men had built and tracked them to his ranch. He also mentioned that Snood had quit his job because he couldn't work for a water thief, cattle rustler, and sheep killer like Holderness. Holderness stood frozen with hate as Langford warned him to leave the country before someone killed him. Langford slowly backed out of the saloon, keeping his right hand high and his eyes on the crowd until he reached the door. He then mounted his horse, Silvermane, and spurred him into a wild gallop. As Langford rode, he encountered Beale and his companions at a street corner. He guided Silvermane towards them, and the horse swerved to the left, striking Beale with his left foreleg and sending him to the ground. Langford glanced back at Holderness, who was still seething with anger, before disappearing from sight. Hollering dudes came pouring out of the saloon, blasting shots at Langford. But the bullets missed him, whizzing harmlessly past. When he reached the corner house, his sight of them was cut off. Silvermane extended his body, lowering himself to the ground, his white mane fluttering in the wind as he pointed his nose towards the desert. Chapter 11. As the sun began to set, Jack Langford finally arrived at Seeping Springs. The once neatly trimmed logs were now just a pile of gray ashes, and the ground surrounding the pool was black and hard from the hooves of many horses. Even the board flume that once carried water was now level with the ground. As Langford was letting his horse, Silvermane, drink from the pool, he heard a loud shout. It was Dave Justice, who had just arrived with his father, August, and his brothers, riding on a pack train. Dave swung off his horse and grabbed Langford with both hands. "Now you've really done it," he exclaimed. "I know exactly what you've been up to, and it's going to make Father furious, but I don't care." The other justices rode down the slope and lined up their horses before the pool, staring in shock at the burnt remains of the homestead. August Justice, the father, surveyed the scene slowly and then turned his wrathful gaze on Langford. "What in tarnation is going on here?" he demanded in his booming voice. Langford told the whole story of what had happened, and August's face grew even darker as he listened. His eagle-like gaze had a strange, far-seeing light in it, as if he was tapping into some mystic power of revelation. I see," he said haltingly. Suddenly Dave let out a deafening yell that echoed through the valley. "Ki-yi-yi!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, his face red and his neck corded with passion. His father quickly ordered him to be quiet and turned back to Langford. "This was madness," he said sternly, "but tell me everything you learned." So Langford repeated the story he had heard from the bishop about the killing of Jacob Severino by Beale. The justices listened intently, their faces growing grimmer with each passing moment. But Langford knew that he had done the right thing, and he was ready to face the consequences. August Justice lowered his head and his massive body trembled with emotion. Jacob Severino was the last of his lifelong friends. "So you say you caught this outlaw?" Justice asked, his voice shaking with grief. "Yes. He didn't see me coming until my horse Silvermane was on him. He tried to dodge, but Silvermane's knee knocked him down," replied the person who caught the outlaw. "What will come of this?" Justice asked, turning to his eldest son for guidance. "The gates are open," Snap Justice replied, clicking his teeth together. "Father," Dave Justice spoke up, "Jack has done a great thing. The news will spread throughout Utah like wildfire. The Mormons are slow, but they need a leader. We can't solve these problems by just hoping and praying. We have to fight." "Dave's right, Dad. It means we have to fight," George added, his fist clenched in the air. "You've been holding us back, Father. Holderness will take the water and food away from our children." "We have to fight," Zeke Justice chimed in, his jaw bulging. "Let's ride to White Sage," Snap Justice suggested, his eyes sparkling. "I'll confront Beale. He's been trying to recruit me for his gang. I'll kill him." He laughed and drew his blue Colt from his holster, holding it out in front of him. Beale and Holderness's fate hung in the balance between two deadly snaps of this desert wolf's teeth. He was one of the justices, but he was different from them. He didn't care about religion, friendship, or even his own life. August Justice's massive body shook once again, but this time it wasn't with grief. He was struggling to resist the fiery spirit of fighting that had taken hold of his sons. "I am forbidden," he said softly, his words carrying a weight of inner struggle and duty beyond this world. "Let's take the cattle to Silver Cup and then go home. I'm giving up Seeping Springs. Maybe this valley and water will satisfy Holderness." As they arrived at the oasis, Langford was taken aback to find out that it was Christmas Eve. The long-awaited return of the riders was celebrated with open arms. But Langford couldn't help but feel disappointed that Mescal was nowhere to be found. Her absence took away from the joy of the homecoming, leaving Langford to wish for her welcoming smile. The winter in the desert was brief, but the Christmas Day snow and ice didn't stand a chance against the sun's reflection off the walls. The early morning was dedicated to religious services, and a grand feast was held in August Justice's cabin at noon. The stone fireplace roared with burning logs, and the table was overflowing with food. Although Langford tried to enjoy the meal, his mind was preoccupied with the fear that Mescal would sit next to Snap Justice. When Snap finally took his seat opposite his pale wife, Langford found himself anxiously waiting for Mescal's arrival with a fervor that left him oblivious to everything else. The girls, Judith, Esther, and Rebecca, came running in, adorned in their finest dresses and bright ribbons to honor the occasion. Rebecca sat beside Snap, and Langford's throat tightened with a hard swallow. Mescal wasn't a Mormon's wife yet. A sudden sense of elation lifted Langford up, making him feel lightheaded with the assurance that Mescal wasn't married to Snap. But that moment was nothing compared to what came next. Under the table, Mescal's hand found his, boldly and joyfully pressing it. Langford's heart raced as he felt the blood rush to his ears. That moment was pure happiness, but it was nothing compared to what was yet to come. Throughout the entire time that August Justice was carving the turkey, Langford's hand remained intertwined with Mescal's. Snap Justice kept a watchful eye on them, but the warmth of her touch made Langford feel a subtle change in the girl he loved. In the months that had passed, something had shifted within her, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was because of his absence. Had she come to realize her own heart? Later that day, Langford left the house and spent some time with his horse, Silvermane. He then made his way to the edge of the oasis and found a seat on the fence. The coming weeks would be a challenge for him. He would be near Mescal, but constantly reminded that she was not his to have. In the past, he had allowed himself to dream of her, but those dreams had become chains that he couldn't break free from. As he sat lost in thought, the sound of hooves approaching brought him back to reality. Mescal came rushing towards him on her horse, Black Topper. She stopped next to him and shyly handed him a red scarf embroidered with Navajo symbols in white and red beads. "I wanted to give you this," she said, "as a little Christmas present." Langford was speechless for a moment. "Did you make this for me, Mescal?" he finally asked. "How good of you. I'll treasure it always." "Put it on now and let me tie it there," Langford hesitated. "But what if they see it?" "I don't care who sees it," Mescal replied, meeting his gaze with unwavering eyes. Her words held a deeper meaning. He stared at her, his heart aching with a longing he had suppressed for too long. Her face was familiar but different. The same features and colors, yet her soul and spirit had transformed. The shadows still lingered in her eyes, but now there was a glimmer of determination and reflection. Her entire being had been refined. "Mescal, what happened to you? You seem almost happy. Did he give up on you?" he asked. "Don't you know Mormons better than that?" "As far as they're concerned, nothing has changed," she replied. "But Mescal, are you going to marry him?" he pleaded. "Never," she said firmly. Her response was immediate, unwavering, and desperate. Langford realized where she had changed. "But you're promised to him, pledged to him. How will you get out of it?" he asked. "I don't know how, but I'll cut out my tongue and be mute before I speak the words that'll make me Snap Justice's wife," she said. There was a long pause. Mescal ran her fingers through Topper's mane, and Langford stared at the walls, lost in thought. Finally he spoke. "I'm afraid for you. Snap watched us today at dinner," he said. "He's just jealous," she replied. "What if he sees this scarf?" he asked. Mescal laughed defiantly. It was confusing for Langford to hear her. "He'll never kill you," she said impulsively. Langford's laugh echoed Mescal's as he pointed to the graves under the wall. Her face turned pale, but then she blushed. "Snap Justice will never kill you," she said. "Mescal," he said, grabbing her hand. "Do you love me?" The trembling of her fingers and the heaving of her bosom gave him hope. "Mescal, these past few months have felt like years. Years of hard work, thinking, and change, but always loving you. I'm not the same man you knew. I'm wild, I'm starving for a sight of you. I love you, Mescal, my desert flower." He spoke with fervor as he reached out to her, his hand landing on her shoulder. She swayed toward him, her free hand also reaching out to touch him. He held her tight for a moment before finally releasing her. "I'm quite mad," he exclaimed, filled with self-reproach. "What a risk I'm putting on you, but I couldn't help it. Look at me just once, please, Mescal, just one look. Now go." The days that followed were filled with drama. Langford had plenty of freedom, with little work to do besides caring for Silvermane. He tried hunting foxes in the caves and clefts, rode up and down the broad space under the walls, and sought the open desert only to be driven back by the bitter, biting winds. When he returned to the big living room of the Justices, he found Mescal there most of the time. She was working on a new buckskin frock, bent over it with her needle and beads. Langford tried to talk to her whenever he had the chance, speaking one language with his tongue and a far different one with his eyes. When she wasn't around, he stared into the glowing red fire and dreamed of her. In the evenings, Snap came in to woo Mescal and drew her into a corner, with Langford watching with covert glances and smoldering jealousy. In his mind, he had come to see all things and all people in the desert glass, and his symbol for Snap Justice was the desert hawk. Snap's eyes were as wild and piercing as those of a hawk. His nose and mouth were as the beak of a hawk. His hands resembled the claws of a hawk, and the spurs he wore, always bloody, were still more significant of his ruthless nature. Snap's pursuit of the girl was as smooth and calculated as a hawk's ascent before its sudden dive for prey. Langford found it unbearable to sit in the evenings with the family, attempting to engage with the children and converse with August Justice while his attention was unconsciously drawn to the couple in the corner. It was a wretched hour for him, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. He never witnessed Snap lay a hand on her, nor did he hear Mescal speak much. When the hour ended and Mescal rose to retire to her room, his doubts and misery vanished as she bid him good night with a swift glance that conveyed womanliness, purity, and something beyond his understanding. Her Indian mystique hinted at a hidden power that could free her from the Mormon's grasp, but Langford couldn't comprehend it. In that good-night glance there was a message meant for him alone, if a woman's gaze could hold such meaning. It proclaimed, "I will remain true to you and to myself." Occasionally, Langford considered leaving the oasis and venturing into Utah once spring arrived, but the thought quickly dissipated. This place had revitalized his spirit, and he couldn't bear the idea of leaving it behind. He adored the serene and peaceful oasis where the sun always shone on the gleaming walls. He cherished the cedar-scented plateau where he found new hope, and the sand strips where he rejuvenated his weary youth with hard outdoor labor. He had a deep affection for the canyon that led to Coconina, revealing a vast abyss, but above all he was enamored with the painted desert, which displayed ever-changing landscapes in sweeping dust, bare peaks, and a purple haze. The beauty of these places, with their wildness, resonated with something strange and untamed within him, and he knew he could never leave them. Once his fervor had subsided and his blood had cooled, happiness would return to him. During the early winter, Snap Justice had forced his wife to accompany him to his father's house, where she remained in a room, pale-faced and consumed with jealousy, while he pursued Mescal. A scene ensued. Although Langford was not present, he knew the outcome. Snap had been furious, his father grave, Mescal tearful and ashamed. The wife found various ways to interrupt her husband's courtship, sending the children to fetch him, feigning illness, claiming the corral gate was open, and his beloved cream-colored Pinto was running loose and even setting fire to her cottage. One Sunday evening, shortly before twilight, Langford was sitting on the porch with August Justice and Dave when Snap's loud calls for his wife interrupted their conversation. The sounds initially came from inside his cabin, and then he put his head out of the window and yelled. It was evident that he was both impatient and angry, and he was due for his Sunday visit to Mescal. "Something's not right," muttered Dave. "Hester! Hester!" Snap yelled. Mother Ruth appeared and informed him that Hester was not there. "Where is she?" Snap banged his fists on the windowsill. "Someone find Hester!" Snap yelled in anger. "That woman stole all my clothes while I was asleep and ran off with them. I have nothing to wear." Father Justice, trying to keep the peace on the Sabbath, calmed Snap down and asked for more details. August and Dave, listening in, couldn't help but burst out laughing at Snap's predicament. Jack Langford, feeling sorry for Snap's wife, watched as Snap became more and more infatuated with Mescal, neglecting his wife and becoming a kinder, more attentive man. As the days grew warmer, Langford took to walking, and one evening he overheard a heated argument between a man and a woman near Snap's cottage. As he stood with his arm resting on Silvermane, a woman's scream pierced through the air, starting high-pitched and then fading to a muffled groan. The sound caused him to tense up, his hand clenching tightly. When he returned to the cottage, a low moaning confirmed his suspicions. Later that evening, Snap appeared particularly cheerful and asked his father to set a date for the wedding. August obliged, announcing it loudly with a sense of relief. The Mormon guests congratulated Mescal in their own unique way. Langford, watching the girl closely, noticed no trace of shyness or embarrassment. When Snap leaned in to kiss her, she turned her face slightly so that his lips brushed her cheek. She remained composed throughout the encounter, leaving Langford feeling resentful and disappointed. He retreated to his room, feeling defeated and convinced that she had given in. Although he knew she was powerless to resist, he couldn't help feeling betrayed. The night was long and restless, his mind burning with thoughts of what love had cost him. By morning, he had come to accept the situation to some degree. The wedding day arrived, and despite the fact that it was not a holiday and the men were packing for the ranges, there was a sense of festivity in the air. With a spring in his step and a confident demeanor, Snap Justice made his way towards Langford with a slow smile. Meanwhile, Paiute prepared to lead his new flock up to the plateau. The household was bustling with activity as the women tended to their chores and the children played around. As the afternoon turned to twilight, Langford sought solace in the quiet shadows near the river trail. He planned to stay there until August Justice had officially pronounced his son and Mescal as husband and wife. The sound of the rapids in the distance created a soothing ambiance, while a bright white star rose over the dark rim of the wall. As Langford was lost in thought, he heard the soft patter of moccasined feet approaching him. Suddenly Mescal appeared with her faithful companion Wolf by her side. She whispered his name, and Langford was taken aback by her sudden appearance. She asked him if he still loved her, and Langford was filled with a sense of uncertainty as her words held an underlying motive. Despite the impending marriage, Mescal urged Langford to listen to her and quickly told him that she loved him before disappearing into the darkness of the river trail. Langford was left bewildered and called out to her, but she was gone without a trace. The only answer he received was the echo of his own voice. Chapter 12. As soon as he regained his senses, Langford knew that he had to act quickly. He couldn't let on that he had any idea of Mescal's escape. He stealthily made his way through the cottonwoods, avoiding any glimmer of light. Once he was sure he was safe, he crept along the dark side of the house and made it to his room. He collapsed onto his bed, trying to calm himself down and silence the pounding of his heart. Mescal had done it. She had escaped the clutches of the hawk. While Langford lay there trying to collect himself, he could hear the sounds of the party coming from the living room. Suddenly there was a knock at his door. It was August Justice. "Jack, are you there?" he asked. "Yes," Langford replied. "Come along, then," August said. Langford followed him to the living room where the justices were gathered around the table. Snap Justice and his wife arrived, and Langford couldn't help but notice how pale she looked. Mother Ruth gave her a sympathetic look as she took her by the hand. August Justice began to read from the Bible, and the room grew quiet. Then he asked, "Why don't they bring her in?" Mother Mary called out to Judith and Esther to fetch Mescal, but when they burst into the room they exclaimed, "Mescal's not there!" August went to the door and called out her name, but there was no answer. "She hadn't put on her white frock," Judith added. Esther spoke up, her tone worried. "Mescal's buckskins ain't where they ought to be," she said. August Justice closed his Bible and looked up. "I was afraid of this," he said simply. Snap Justice rushed into Mescal's room and came back with her white wedding dress. "The time she took to put this on, she's been—" He trailed off, overcome with emotion. He threw the dress into the fire, causing his wife to faint. Then Snap began to lose control, tearing at his own clothing and cursing. August had to physically restrain him and drag him out of the room. The children were crying and the wives were mourning. The men searched the house and surrounding areas but found no trace of Mescal. Hours passed and the commotion died down. The next morning it was discovered that Mescal had left with a knapsack full of food and her horse, Wolf. Noddle, her other horse, was missing from his corral. The peon slave had not slept in his shack. There were tracks in the sand by the river crossing, moccasin, burro, and dog. One of the boats was gone, but it was not moored on the other side. Dave Justice rowed out and found the boat a mile downriver, flipped over, and stuck on a sandbar. "She made it across and then set the boat loose," August said. "That's just like an Indian. If she went to the Navajos up on the cliffs, maybe we'll find her." As they gazed out into the painted desert, Snap Justice's father shook his head gravely. It was clear that if Snap were to venture out there, it would only lead to his downfall. Unfortunately, Snap was already in a bad way, lying unconscious and drunk on his porch. "This is the end for him," his father sighed. "He had a chance with Mescal, but now he's lost it all to his thirst for rum." With a heavy heart, Snap's father ordered his sons to drive the sheep up to the plateau and ride out to the cattle ranges. They had to keep busy, or they would surely fall into the same trap as Snap. Meanwhile, he would pack and get ready to search for Mescal at the Navajo cliffs. Crossing the river was easy enough, and soon they were on their way. As they loaded the burros with packs and a water bag, August pointed out some tracks in the sand. They were the imprints of little moccasins, which reassured Langford, who had been worried about the upturned boat. However, as they continued on their journey, Snap's father couldn't help but wonder what they would do if they found Mescal. "Bringing her back might only put her in danger," he mused. "Snap's just as likely to kill her as he is to marry her." At this, Jack interrupted. "Give her to me," he said firmly. "I love her." Snap's father was taken aback by this, but he couldn't deny that Jack's feelings were genuine. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know why you're any different from the others, but I guess it was that time you spent with her on the plateau." With that, they continued on their way, unsure of what the future held for them all. "You feeling better now, Langford?" August Justice asked as they rode along the trail under Echo Cliffs. "Yeah, I'm feeling all right," Langford replied, still sounding a bit weak. "I thought you too sick to think of a woman," August joked. "Mescal cares for me," Langford replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Ah, that accounts. Langford, did you play me fair?" August asked, his tone turning serious. "We tried to, though we couldn't help loving," Langford admitted. "She would have married Snap but for you," August said, a hint of accusation in his voice. "Yes, but I couldn't help that. You brought me out here and saved my life. I know what I owe you. Mescal meant to marry your son when I left for the range last fall, but she's a true woman and couldn't. August Justice, if we ever find her, will you marry her to him now?" Langford asked, his voice pleading. "That depends. Did you know she intended to run?" August asked, his tone serious. "I never dreamed of it. I learned it only at the last moment. I met her on the river trail," Langford explained. "You should have stopped her," August said sternly. Langford maintained silence. "You should have told me," August continued. "I couldn't. I'm only human," Langford replied, his voice full of regret. Well, I'm not blaming you, Langford. I had hot blood once, but I'm afraid the desert will not be large enough for you and Snap. She's pledged to him. You can't change the Mormon Church. For the sake of peace, I'd give you Mescal if I could. Snap will either have her or kill her. I'm going to hunt this desert in advance of him, because he'll trail her like a hound. It would be better to marry her to him than to see her dead, August said, his voice full of concern. I'm not so sure of that, Langford said, his voice full of doubt. Langford, your nose is on a blood scent like a wolf's. I can see I've always seen well, remember it's man-to-man between you now, August said, his voice full of warning. As they rode, they wound under Echo Cliffs, gradually climbing and working up to a level with the desert, which they presently attained at a point near the head of the canyon. The trail swerved to the left, following the base of the cliffs. The tracks of Noddle and Wolf were plainly visible in the dust. Langford was certain that if they ventured out into the vast expanse of the desert, their chances of finding mescal were slim. They followed the trail of the dog and burro until they reached Bitter Seeps, a shallow spring of alkali where they lost all signs of their prey. The path leading up to the Navajo ranges was old and worn, etched into solid rock by time, and showed no recent signs of passage. The ridges of shale and the washes of copper earth scorched by the sun provided no clues to the direction the fugitives had taken. August Justice shrugged his broad shoulders and headed towards the cliff. They arrived at dusk and set up camp near a towering crag. As the wind died down, the night became more bearable. Langford, finding August Justice unresponsive and tired, took a walk along the rim of the cliff, reminiscing about his sheep-herding days. The sweet fragrance of trees and bushes, the soft whisper of the wind, the opening and closing of the bright stars in the sky, the stillness and the feeling of the vast emptiness beneath him all reminded him of his past, which he could never forget. The silence was filled with distant and faint sounds, such as the mournful howl of a wolf or the moaning of the wind in a jagged crag. It was a strange and low, incoherent voice that rose from the desert, winding its way along the empty trail, breaking free in the open air and fading away. He had heard the roar of a lion and the yowl of a wildcat before, but this was the eerie sound that August Justice had mentioned, the enigmatic call of the canyon and the desert night. When daylight arrived, Echo Cliffs proved to be much larger than the plateau on the other side of the river. The terrain on this side of the Vermilion tableland was vastly different from the roll of Cedar Level, the heave of Craggy Ridge, and the dip of White Sage Valley. August Justice led the way on a trail that took them back towards the river. The thick cedars mostly obscured Langford's view, but occasionally he caught glimpses of the surroundings from high points or wide prospects where the trail overlooked an oval hemmed-in valley. Around midday they came across a thicket and suddenly came upon a declivity. August Justice turned to Langford and waved his hand. "The Navajo camp," he said. "Eshta has lived there for many years. It's the only permanent Navajo camp I know. These Indians are nomads. Most of them live wherever the sheep lead them. This plateau ranges for 100 miles, farther than any white man knows, and everywhere in the valleys and green nooks will be found Navajo hogans. That's why we may never find mescal." Langford looked down at the pleasant vale dotted with round, mound-like hogans streaked with white. Lazy columns of blue smoke floated upward, and mustangs, burros, and sheep grazed on the white patches of grass. Bright red blankets hung from the cedar branches, and there was a slow, colorful movement of Indians passing in and out of their homes. The scene brought to mind long, warm afternoons and leisure that took no stock of time. As they made their way down the trail, they encountered a flock of sheep driven by a little Navajo boy on a brown burro. The burro stood stock still, and the boy was equally surprised, kicking and pounding his shaggy steed before jumping off and running with black locks flying. Farther down, Indian girls started up from their tasks and darted silently into the shade of the cedars. As August Justice and Langford reached the valley, they were greeted by Indian braves who appeared out of nowhere, eager to shake their hands and lead them towards the center of the encampment. The hogans, where the desert savages lived, all looked the same, except for the chief's, which was larger. From the outside it looked like a mound of clay with a few white logs sticking out, shining against the brick red. August Justice pulled aside a blanket hanging over the door and gestured for Langford to follow him inside. The smell of wood smoke was so thick that Langford had trouble seeing and breathing for a moment. A fire, large enough to attest to the desert Indian's love of warmth, blazed in the middle of the hogan, sending part of its smoke upward through a round hole in the roof. Eshta, with a blanket over his shoulders and his lean black head bent, sat near the fire. He noticed the arrival of his visitors, but went back to his meditative posture and seemed unaware of their presence. Langford followed August's lead, sitting down and saying nothing. However, his eyes discreetly roamed around the room. Eshta's 3 wives were vastly different in age and appearance. The eldest was a wrinkled old hag, blind and sitting before the fire. The next was a solid square squaw, combing a naked boy's hair with a comb made of stiff, thin roots tied tightly in a round bunch. The boy seemed to be in discomfort from the process. The third wife, much younger, had a beautiful face and long braids of black hair, of which she was evidently proud. She leaned on her knees over a flat slab of rock, holding a long oval stone and rolling and mashing corn into meal. The scene was filled with young, handsome braves, their bronze skin shining in the sunlight. They wore bands in their thick, straight hair and silver rings on their ears and bracelets on their wrists. Even their moccasins had silver buttons. The girls were just as curious as they weaved blankets and worked with their wool-carrying needles. The younger children were bright-eyed and full of wonder, while the babies slept soundly on their blankets. The hogan structure was a sight to behold. It was made of forked logs and branches, interwoven into a dome that was both arched and strong. The walls and ceiling were covered in buckskin garments, weapons, and blankets, but the white wood ribs were still visible. When August touched Langford's arm, he turned to see the old chief. Eshta lifted his head and offered his hand in greeting. August struggled with the Navajo language, but he understood it well enough to translate for Langford. "The white prophet is welcome," Eshta said. "Does he come for sheep or braves, or to honor the Navajo in his home?" "Eshta, he seeks the flower of the desert," August replied. "Mescal has left him. Her trail leads to the bitter waters under the cliff and then is as a bird's. Eshta has waited, yet Mescal has not come to him. She has not been here. Mescal's shadow has not gladdened the Navajo's door. She has climbed the crags or wandered into the canyons. The White Father loves her. He must find her. Eshta's braves and mustangs are for his friend's use. The Navajo will find her if she is not as the grain of drifting sand. But is the white prophet wise in his years?" The flower of the desert was torn between two worlds. Eshta, the Navajo leader, believed that Mescal should embrace her Indian heritage and stay with her people. But Mescal was also half white and had been raised with the ways of the white man. Eshta did not consider the white man's love and only thought of Indian blood.